Hey guys, it's Madison. As we are entering February, I'm going to be posting a lot of videos this month on romance and love, and at times, the darker side of love. Today's video is about romance and horror. It's not always easy to juggle romantic subplots in a genre dedicated to the gross and horrifying. Some people think that romance has no place in horror. Those people are wrong. Gothic literature, which is a predecessor to the horror genre, is full of romantic storylines. And Gothic horror, which is the origin of all horror, is full of women running around castles and mansions, figuring out that their new husband has a terrible secret. A hidden wife, a hidden ghost wife, etc. Basically, romance and horror has been around as long as horror has been a genre. Regardless of what kind of romantic storyline you're going for, there's a few things that you should consider doing to enhance your romantic storyline, and a few things that you should avoid. One thing you should do is use comfort as a large component of the romance. Because your lovebirds are going through something super traumatic, they'll probably turn to each other for comfort. This not only gives them a reason to be drawn to each other, but it also makes the story feel more believable as well. It's not likely that your character is going to want to make out with their love interest right after discovering that a cursed object is trying to kill them. But a hug, a pat on the shoulder, sure, why not? Maybe that'll lead to something else later on, and maybe it won't, but the point is that seeking comfort is going to be a large part of why these two characters are initially drawn together. Another thing to keep in mind is that romantic storylines in horror tend to have quick pacing. Romantic subplots in horror can feel a little bit more rushed than in other genres, and that's generally okay. Horror can cause people to bond more quickly than they would in other circumstances. For instance, in the novella The Langoliers, Laurel and Nick have only known each other for a day by the time Nick is ready to sacrifice himself to save them all, and yet she is heartbroken that he's going to do so, and he kisses her before doing so. Clearly they have formed a very strong bond in a short amount of time. One thing you should absolutely do is put your main character's love interest in danger. I feel this should be mandatory in horror stories. Why else would you give your main character someone to love if not to dangle the possibility of losing them forever by endangering them? This creates high stakes, and as we all know, torturing protagonists by threatening to take away everything that they love is what all writers love to do right before we go and have tea with Satan. One thing that you should do is have the horror bring out the best and the worst in your characters. Maybe your main character finds that they are less sensitive to the needs of others when under extreme duress, but that they find an inner strength that allows them to do what they need to do to get the job done. By having your characters show off their best selves, that gives them a chance to respect and admire each other. And by having them show off their worst selves, that gives them a chance to learn to love and embrace the worst parts of each other. And honestly, what's more romantic than that? And since this is horror, on a literal level, this can mean still loving the person who has been temporarily possessed by a demon, turned into a squid monster, or trapped in a parallel dimension. If your love can survive that, surely Christmas with the in-laws will be a breeze, right? Right? My last tip is know if you're writing a horror story with a romantic subplot or a paranormal romance. Look, your character's going through some stuff, okay? They got problems. Real problems. Ghosts, monsters, demons, serial killer, whatever. The point is, they don't have time to be daydreaming about the hot guy all day. They need to focus, or they're gonna die. If your main character is thinking about romance as often as she is casting out the ghosts in her house, you're probably not writing a horror story. You're probably writing a paranormal romance. Which is fine, but understand that whenever you're writing a romance story, it's a lot harder to take the horror elements seriously. I mean, how dangerous can the antagonist be if your main character is thinking about getting laid every 5 minutes? Mac Childs had this to say on his article on romance and horror, Love is a Disease, Preventing the Romantic Storyline from Strangling Your Story. Romantic fiction uses a different kind of tension. Will the protagonist suffer heartbreak? Will the couple get together? End up together? Then the kind of tension found in horror, which is usually external threats and an emphasis on survival. To correct this, he suggests plotting your story scene by scene and chapter by chapter to see which tensions are driving your story. Then bring those tensions into balance by disrupting the parts of your story where the romance begins to take over. And if you want to write paranormal romance, you can do the reverse. Now that we've covered 5 things you should do, here are 5 things you should avoid if you don't want your reader to throw your book across the room. Number 1 thing you shouldn't do is long melodramatic confessions of love. There are definitely some genres that call for the long, over-the-top melodramatic confessions of love, usually contemporary romance. It wouldn't feel right if the girl that's been dealing with her commitment issues throughout the entire story doesn't proclaim her love in a long, public, drawn-out speech, preferably in front of as many secondary characters as possible, so they can all turn to each other and say, "See, I knew they'd end up together." But horror? Not so much. One of my biggest pet peeves is the long melodramatic confession of love in a horror story. There are definitely some exceptions to this, especially if the villain is the one giving the love confession, because then generally their confession is part of the horror rather than a distraction from it. But in general, shorter love confessions are much more appropriate in a horror story. I really love the novel Nosferatu, but Vic's love confession to Lou could have easily been half as long and it would have been better. Seriously, she needed to get her butt to Christmasland and save her son. Yes, it's true this was probably her last chance to tell Lou that she loved him, but still, she had things to do. Plus, who can think of a long, drawn-out, melodramatic love confession at a time like that? There's really a time whenever your character should have a one-track mind. This brings me to my next point, which is avoid bad timing. Know when to insert romance into your story. The answer is during the less intense parts of your story, usually the parts without any horror. The best time to insert romantic moments is whenever the characters are trying to process what just happened or figure out what is going on, and the danger seems to be gone for the moment. When your son has just been kidnapped or there's a monster in the next room, that's not the time to get mushy. Romantic moments tend to kill the tension, so you need to know when they belong in your story, when they should be moved, or when they should be left out altogether. My next tip is avoid making the love interest just the love interest. The love interest should most likely be an ally in helping the protagonist defeat the villain or overcome whatever horrifying situation they're in. Even if the love interest isn't an ally, they should have a direct role in the story somehow. The love interest can even end up being the villain, but whatever you do, don't just put them in the story so that your character has something to pine for. Give the love interest their own goals and sense of agency. Something else you shouldn't do is have the protagonist and the love interest agree on everything. Because when people agree on everything, that can be really boring. Although they probably should have the same main goal, which is, saving the helpless child, saving the world, vanquishing the evil, whatever. How they want to go about it might be different. He might want to sneak into the building and kill all of the zombies in order to save the child, and maybe she just wants to convince the child to climb down the fire escape because, she's not a suicidal idiot. Of course, sometimes they will have different goals. Maybe he wants to have a seance so that they can figure out what the spirits want and then convince them to leave, and she just wants to burn the whole haunted house to the ground and collect the insurance money. Wait, why has that not already been the ending to a haunted house movie yet? That would be amazing. Ooh, we want you to know who killed us and find our bodies. Dude, I don't care who killed you. I just want full coverage in an insurance company that doesn't investigate house fires too closely. And if your characters do have different goals, that's okay, as long as they come together in the end. Whether that means that she gives up her arson daydreams and learns how to exorcise ghosts so that they can keep living in their home, or maybe it means he accepts that he's fallen in love with a firebug and begins reading How to Cover Up Your Loved One's Acts of Arson for Dummies. As long as your characters can get on the same page before the end of the story, it's okay to introduce conflict between them. In fact, it usually makes the story better. Lastly, don't make your love interest solve all of your protagonist's problems. It's super annoying. It strips your protagonist of agency and makes them flat and boring. In fact, it's usually better if your love interest introduces more problems, because that's usually what love interests do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I'll be posting lots of romantic horror content this month, including book reviews on my favorite romantic bizarro novels and a video on my favorite romantic villain. As always, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you later.